I think what we do know, of course, is a lot of those big builders, those national builders, are also in the pockets of national government. They contribute quite a lot in terms of funding. They donate to those policies or parties which they think are going to, support them. There's a lot of, flow in terms of between a national builder and government. And this is, of course, where you have centralised power, which becomes very, very big and unwieldy. It's going to be influenced. I mean, that is actually the nature of fascism.
Hey UK property people, we'd love to have you join us at This Property Life Networking. It's a no-guru friendly community. Our network gets a private WhatsApp group for daily advice and deal sharing, monthly online networking with live market updates and in-person events every year. Hit the link in the description below, join today and start building real connections with active property investors. Welcome to This Property Life, the podcast where we cut through the noise and talk honestly about what's really happening in the property world. I'm your host, Sarah Blaney, and today I'm joined by someone who doesn't shy away from big conversations, Wendy Whitaker-Large. Wendy's well known in the industry for her work with HMOs, education and supporting landlords. And in this episode, we're tackling a bit of a tricky one. It's sparks plenty of debate, and it's all about, are landlords responsible for the housing crisis? So we're going to dig into the realities behind some of the headlines, look at supply, planning, government policy, investor behaviour, and then what's actually driving the shortage of homes in the UK. So Wendy's going to bring a really balanced, experience-led take, and together we're going to hopefully cut through some of the blame game and look at what landlords can actually control and what they absolutely can't, and what needs to change if we want a bit of a healthier, more functional housing system. It's straight talking, hopefully thought-provoking, and whether you're a landlord, tenant, developer, or somewhere in between, hopefully you'll take something valuable from it. Let's dive in. Welcome, Wendy, to This Property Life. How are you this cold morning?
Hello, Sarah. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a thorny issue that we're going to talk about today. I'm sure it'll divide some people, but hopefully it will spark conversation, because I think that's the thing, isn't it? In today's world, especially, we've got lots of information, not all of it's factual or misconstrued, perhaps. Hopefully we can cut through some of the noise and give a balanced opinion on, are landlords actually responsible for the housing crisis?
Such a great question. Are landlords responsible for the housing crisis? First of all, I think we've got to understand, what do we mean by the housing crisis? Now, some people mean the fact that houses are becoming more and more expensive to buy and to rent. Some people might think that the lack of supply is a factor. I think generally what's referred to by that question is what I might call secondhand properties. I don't think we can blame landlords for the fact that houses aren't being built. We can't blame landlords for, the fact that completions are down significantly this year. I think only about 45,000 completions have taken place in 2025. So this is a long, long, long way from the government target. Now, this is, of course, new homes being built. But as we know, there's a huge amount of property in the secondhand market, properties that get transacted every day. And many of those, of course, are bought by landlords. And there are about 4.7 million privately rented households in the UK. So probably there's fewer than that landlords, because some of those, of course, are going to have portfolios. So about 20% of properties are privately rented. Many of those houses, as we know, actually are never going to be by traditional homeowners. And why is that? Well, quite a lot of them have fallen into disrepair. You find that many of those kind of properties need significant refurbishment. They may have structural problems. They may have been damaged by the previous owner or been left empty for a long time. So again, there's significant investment that's going to be needed to bring those properties up to habitable standard. Now, for many purchasers of property, they don't have the cash to be able to do that. In fact, what we find is that in terms of people buying properties, particularly over the last 10 years, more and more people, they're waiting to buy a property until they can afford something that is of a good standard. In other words, they're putting their cash into saving up for a bigger deposit and then getting a bigger mortgage, rather than moving into a property and refurbishing it. And this comes from evidence from some high street retailers, like, for example, B&Q and other operations, that are saying that those kind of activities in the housing market flatlining, that people are not choosing to spend cash and money doing up their properties, partly because, of course, the cost of living has affected the cash in their pocket as well. But if you can afford a bigger mortgage, many people are then choosing to either buy something that is nearly new and something also that is more energy efficient. They save on running costs.
Every month on the second Saturday, we run an online networking session where you can meet other active investors face to face. And 3 times a year, we bring everyone together at live in-person events. Spaces are always limited, so if you want to be part of it, check out thispropertylife.co.uk/events and secure your spot today.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because if I look at the properties that I bought in the past, they've been on the market, some of them, bought off Rightmove, etc. These guys have been on the market for like over 12 months. So they had ample opportunity to be snapped up by owner-occupiers, but they were in such disrepair, they didn't attract any wanted to buy them and live in them and do them up. So the only people that would look at them were investors. And, you know, most of my portfolio, I've had to go back to brick and completely refurb. So, you know, I think that's a really valid point. There is a lot of stock on the market that an owner-occupier will just disregard.
I think also we, unfortunately, in the UK, tend to have a media that is very London-centric. And while we know that home ownership in London is much lower than the rest of the country because of the price of properties, and because it has a more transient population, and because there are just simply more people living there, more people want to live there. But the issue that you have then is that quite often statistics are brought to bear which relate to London but don't relate to the rest of the country. For example, I live about 8 miles away from Stoke-on-Trent. And in Stoke, you can buy a property for £60,000 or £70,000. Now, it's not going to be in great condition. It's not going to be Buckingham Palace. It might be a 2 up, 2 down. Probably does need some work doing to it. In fact, it would need some work doing to it at that price. But for a first-time buyer, even on minimum wage, and particularly maybe if they have a partner, they could save up deposit to be able to buy that property over a year to 18 months. And frankly, the price would not increase significantly over that time, maybe by a couple of £1,000s. They would be eligible for a mortgage if they're in a steady job and they can prove regular pay slips and regular income. And they would be able to then move into that property and refurbish it and live in it while they're doing it. Now, I'm not saying it would necessarily be, all rose-tinted spectacles and, the most amazing life they've ever had for those first couple of years, but they could do it. And nowadays, of course, there's a lot of inspiration on social media. I often see on Instagram, on my Instagram feed, people who've bought properties and refurbishing them, or they're doing their own DIY, and it's great to see. And I really enjoy that. I really enjoy that kind of self-starter approach to property, because there are many properties that have just over time fallen into disrepair. Now, part of the reason for that is that when we look at, again, home ownership, the majority of people who own their homes are over 65. There's a much lower proportion of people under the age of 35 who own property. I think the average age of first time buying a property in London is 38. So again, looking at London statistics, 38, you're nearly 40 years old before you're buying your very first property. But in the rest of the UK, it's significantly lower at about 31. So we have this sort of skewed idea that, buy-to-let investors are buying up all those properties, and it's pricing young people out of the market. Well, actually, that's just not true. But it is this sense of, I suppose, if you've got a job and you've maybe got hobbies, you don't want to spend the weekend replumbing the bathroom. You don't want to have to pay an electrician to upgrade your electricity supply in your home and do it safely, of course. You don't want to be retiling the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. You'd rather go down to the pub, watch the football, go out for a walk. Well, these are all choices that people make with their lives. But when I, for example, when I first bought my own home, which was in 1989, many, many, many moons ago, it was far from perfect. It was quite a drafty Victorian terrace property. It didn't have double glazing. We had an open fire. We had a very basic kitchen. We didn't have a shower. We just had a bath, and I had one of those dreadful sort of shower attachments I had to put over the taps to wash my hair. It was very, very basic, but it got me on the property ladder. And I think that nowadays there are complaints that you sometimes hear and again get highlighted by the media about people unable to buy property, but they haven't looked outside the confines of where they're living to find a place that is affordable. And yes, you might have to make some compromises. You might have to move up to the northeast. You might have to move to the northwest. You might have to find somewhere that is, slightly less salubrious than where you're living right now. But it can be done. And that's, I feel, one of the elements in this whole argument that we have failed to address is, first of all, the London-centric nature of these debates, and secondly, the actual spread of properties across the UK. And I'm talking about, the whole of England, Scotland and Wales here, that are affordable, but people are simply not prepared to make the move or to make the adjustment to buy something in a different location.
If you're loving this episode, don't just listen, subscribe. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss our weekly property chats, deal breakdowns and market updates. It takes a couple of seconds, it's free, and it helps us bring you even better guests and property chat.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that even, I bought my first home probably 25 years ago, and I couldn't afford to buy in the town that I was raised in. So I moved to a different town and bought there. And we were making some of those choices back then. Now, I didn't move too far away. It was, under 20 miles, but it might be a little bit further nowadays, but it might not also. So I think that it is, as you've said, it's skewed by London, the data and the debate. But it's also, I think, just a biased debate, and the information that we're given in the media is, as we know, we are controlled by that narrative, and we are given information that it could be factually correct, but within a confine of statistics around that actually, when you look at it from a wider perspective, it doesn't make sense. So I think that you're completely correct. The London centric and the actual media that we're presented with really skew the debate. But there are, I think there is a history within this country of, because we said we're not going to get into the supply of it and the fact that the house building hasn't kept up. But that really does, I think, add to the narrative, because, we had the 1980s where we had the big right to buy and sell off of council homes. They've never been replaced. Most of them are now probably in, I think 40% of the right to buy under Margaret Thatcher are now in rented, in rented, the rental market. And it wasn't intended that way, but actually the people that bought them, that's what they wanted to do. It's just free market, isn't it? In terms of, we've bought this, we're going to now upgrade to a different house, we'll rent this one out. But that's happened, but nothing has ever replaced the housing that we lost. And then we've had further targets through population changes in the country, which have never, ever been matched. So for the last, 20 years, I think from the 60s, our housing target's been missed every single year.
You're absolutely right. The current statistics say that we have a persistent shortfall of about 66,000 homes per year. The government's target is 300,000. They said when they came in 2024, they were going to build 1.5 million houses between then and 2029. And we've got a massive shortfall of that. Now, my view, going back to the point about social housing and about the sell-off, we have to look at the bigger picture here. What we know is that when people buy their own property, when they are responsible for their own property and they don't rent, they change their attitude to living in their local community. They change their attitude to property rights. And I don't mean that in terms of real estate rights. I mean that in terms of owning anything. When we talk about property as a word, we're referring there to the kind of legal definition of property, which is something you own. Your car is your property. Your bike is your property. Your plant pot is your property. Now, property rights in law are all about the rights you have when you buy something, when you purchase something, you pay something for it, you pay a consideration for something. You are now deemed to own that particular item, whether it's a plant pot or a 4-bed detached house. Now, what we do know is that when people own their own real estate, they own their own house, actually their attitudes to property ownership change. They start to recognise that they have a responsibility to look after that real estate. And this actually impacts a lot of other behaviours. We know that when people, for example, own their own home, they're much more likely to send their children to local schools. They're much more likely to work locally. They're much more likely to contribute to the local community, whether that's financially by using the shops or whether it's by simply participating in community activities. They want to make a difference to where they live. They're much more likely to address things like fly tipping along their street or dog dirt, along their street. They're much more likely to kick up a fuss about it. People take more pride in their surroundings. So the purposes behind Margaret Thatcher selling off those properties, was to enable those people who've been council tenants for many, many years to benefit from the reduction in the purchase price, to encourage them to settle down and become property owners. But it was because she very much believed that people, when they owned their own home, had a change of mindset. And I think that's why I think home ownership is really to be encouraged. We should be encouraging this left, right and centre, because when people own their own home, they have a very different attitude to money. They have a different attitude to borrowing. They have a different attitude to finance. They have a different attitude to debt. And these are critical issues because this has a big impact on the country as a whole. We know that consumer debt, for example, is growing year on year. Now, I don't have the statistics on consumer debt, but whenever I hear them, I'm always utterly shocked. But then on the other hand, we also have a government who is hugely in debt. The government official figures say that we're 2.6 trillion pounds in debt. Actually, if you look at it from other people who've done the analysis, they say it's more like 3 trillion. And in fact, the Taxpayers Alliance said that with all the unfunded commitments of the government, it's more like 12 trillion pounds of government debt. Now, this is a huge millstone because, of course, the government doesn't produce anything. The only income the government have is taxation. And today we're recording this on the day that we're going to be finding out a bit more about the government's plans for taxation as Rachel Reeves unveils her economic policy for the year ahead, or the few years ahead, however long they've got in government. But because the government cannot make anything or manufacture anything, the only income they have is from the good citizens of the UK. So that example that they're setting by living beyond their means, by utilising debt as a way of funding day-to-day living costs, is an extremely bad example. And unfortunately, that example, of course, is filtering down to ordinary people. Now, I know, like any property investor, the importance of leverage. And in fact, I wouldn't be able to invest in property if I didn't have leverage, which is why I am reliant on the banks, like most property investors are. Why would you use your own money if you can use somebody else's money to invest with? And I think this is sometimes where the discussion leads, is the whole moral debate about leverage. But one of the questions for me would be, how many people would be completely disabled from not just investing in property, but buying their own home if they couldn't get a mortgage? How many people would we be disenfranchising if we said we're going to completely remove the ability of people to borrow money from the banks? And of course, as we know, the banking industry relies on flow. It relies on monetary flow. So while the liabilities that a bank has on its balance sheet don't necessarily relate to the assets, in fact, it becomes an asset actually in terms of when a bank lends money to a client, it's not actually a liability anymore. It becomes an asset, and they can actually leverage that further within the banking system. But that's a whole other macroeconomics debate. But for most people, I think it's something like 15 to 18% of the property market is owned outright. But generally, those are people over the age of 60 who've paid their mortgage off over a number of years. They've retired. They've maybe taken part of their pension to pay that final payment, and they now can live in their retirement not having to pay for a mortgage, which becomes, of course, less affordable because they're now living on their pension as opposed to having any other kind of income. So traditionally, that model was very much, you would put down a deposit, get a mortgage, perhaps not a huge mortgage. Again, if we look 40 or 50 years ago, people didn't have to have massive mortgages. Very often it was one. If let's say a couple were buying the property, it was the mortgage would be based on one income earner, generally the man, and the property was affordable in terms of the payments on one salary. But because property prices have gone up and up and up, nowadays that's very unaffordable for most people buying a property. Particularly if they're a couple, it takes two of them, they're a joint income multiplier in order to qualify for a mortgage and also to be able to service that mortgage, of course. So I think that when we look back historically at housing supply, yes, houses did get sold off. I think there was a good reason for that. One of the concerns, one of the beliefs, I suppose, that I have is that what we should be doing as a country, and if I was in charge of policy, I would be doing this, is we've got to help small builders to get their mojo back. In the 1950s, 65% of properties were built by small local builders. Now, what does this mean? This means that, Bob the builder down the road, sorry, I don't mean to be pejorative, but, probably some of them were called Bob, and they might have been called Bill and Dickie and, Ted. But they lived locally. They would do house extensions. They would do different building projects. But if they spotted a plot of land, albeit, maybe a half an acre plot or a quarter of an acre plot, not a particularly big plot of land, or somebody might highlight it to them. Friday night, they're down the pub, somebody taps them on the shoulder. Hey, Ted, guess what? Did you know that Mrs. Jones, with that big plot of land next to her bungalow, she's thinking of selling it. She's thinking of dividing it up and selling off the land. You might be interested. I said to her, you'd pop in next week and, you can maybe chat to her about it. Ted thinks, yeah, that's a great idea. I could build 2, maybe 3 properties on that plot of land and I could sell them off. Fantastic. That's Ted's business. That's what Ted does for a living. That's how Ted makes his money. And what he does is he provides great quality homes to local people. 3 more homes, 2 more homes. Now, if you extrapolate that over a year, not just in one local area, but in 1,000 local areas, all those Teds, all those Bills, all those Dickies, all those Bobs building 3, 4, 5 houses, we could solve the supply of houses in the UK. Now, one of the other things, of course, is the benefit of using small builders, or where small builders build, is that they don't have some of the overhead costs that a large builder has. So very often when a large builder has secured a plot of land, they might have secured it on an option, and they have got a central machine that needs to be serviced. And the cost of servicing that central machine in terms of marketing, in terms of staff costs, in terms of VAT, in terms of the resources that they're needing to run their business, and the kind of big UK national builders, but a proportion of that cost is going to be laid upon the property. So when you buy your 3-bed or 4-bed detached house, there's going to be a proportion of that you're paying to the builder for them to be able to service their company. they may well be able to negotiate some of the resources in terms of the raw material costs because they're a big builder. But quite often, if you are, even if you're a small local builder, you will also be able to source resources at those kind of rates as well. They're not massively different. The cost of providing a brick. Yes, if you're buying 1,000,000 bricks as opposed to 1,000 bricks, no doubt you'll get a slightly bigger discount. But ultimately, the brick maker, and there is actually quite a big brick factory in Stoke-on-Trent, they can't reduce it by a certain level. They can't go beyond their own net unit cost of producing that brick, because then they're going to be out of pocket. So the resources that a small builder utilizes and those of a national or larger builder aren't too different. Also, in terms of wages, we have
bigger one requires, isn't it? And you're right, because I think the UK's largest house builder is Barratt, and you've got Persimmon, Taylor Wimpey, Bellway, Redrow, Vistry. These top 6 house builders dominate our supply of housing, don't they? So if they decide not to build through either the price of the done up value of the properties are not quite where they want them, or the cost of financing because of our banking system and our general economy is not where it is, then they're not going to do it, and they will alter the way our supply is, and that's what's happened, isn't it? Because
it is. It absolutely is, Sarah. I mean, this is why we've got huge land banking, because we've got lots of places in the UK where it's actually, by the time you've built that property, the cost of building the property is higher than what you can sell it for. Now, who's going to want to build a house if they can't make some profit on it?
Obviously, the government have said, we're going to change the planning so that it's easier. Well, we all know what happens when they manipulate stuff. They'll give it the power to the local authorities to, decide on some of these planning policies. And it just doesn't happen, does it? It is just a blocker again. But you're right. I think they need to free up land for the SME builder. So, you're I'm going to build 2 or 3 houses on a plot kind of a person. Because at the moment, it just doesn't work for those guys. They can spend years in planning, which costs. And then, they've actually got to try and build it effectively with all the red tape that goes around that. And we do need to make that a much easier process for them.
Well, I think also a much less expensive process, because you also have Section 106 and community infrastructure levies, CILs, which are also imposed if you're building 2 or more dwellings. Now, I very much believe in this concept of incentives. If you are going to disincentivize somebody, i.e. because they're going to effectively have an additional layer of tax to pay from building 2 properties, who's going to want to do that? It simply disincentivizes the small builder from wanting to build. And it's a very uncertain marketplace. People are nervous about getting mortgages. Of course, there's many people who can't get a mortgage. And even at the moment, of course, we know that the housing market is somewhat frozen up because of the what we're waiting to hear today in terms of the budget. We're thinking about council tax bans and all the other financial considerations that people have. Lots of people are holding off putting their house on the market or holding off moving because they don't want to make that commitment until they understand the lie of the land. Now, of course, this is true of small builders as well. They're also going to be holding back. And you're right, the NPPF, the National Policy Framework, Planning Policy Framework, is going through a review at the moment. And the government is looking at how they can free up or certainly, slightly reduce the challenges to getting planning permission. But planning permission is only one of those many issues. You've also got building regulations. Now, building regulations as well put a huge amount of pressure on houses to be a certain standard. Only a couple of years ago, they changed the standards on insulation. They changed the standards on some of the ratings that needed to be achieved if you were doing either an extension or a new build. Again, this adds to the cost of the build, and ultimately, of course, the client has to pay. Well, if the client hasn't got the money to pay, they're not going to commission the builder to do the work, and then the builder is not going to have that that work. And I mean, just listen to some of my friends who are in the construction industry, many of them who would be self-employed small builders, were they given the freedom, if you like, and the opportunity to do it, have gone to work for bigger building companies because they've got the skills, they've got the knowledge, they're great on site, they can work with a foreman, they can work with a project manager, they know how to build a property, but it's not worth them being self-employed. They make more money by being employed. And this is very dangerous because 99% of companies, of businesses in the UK are small businesses, either self-employed individuals or people who employ up to 50 people. That's a sort of typical cutoff where you might say that's a kind of medium-size employment situation business. 99% of businesses are small. So by disincentivizing builders to run their own business, we are reducing the number of people who are self-starters. And to me, this is really, really critical that we think about this, because what incentives are we giving to people to be self-employed, to run their own business? As you say, the red tape that many of those builders have to cut through, it's unimaginable. And why would anybody want to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, we've covered that sometimes the demographics are misleading, and the information that we're given gives a bias around the London thing. We've also covered that the fact that there has been a sell-off, which was, in your opinion, was done in the right intentions, but that there's no backup plan to produce houses that we need now. So we've missed our targets for decades, and we are living, the outfall of that, aren't we? And all the policy around building homes is not making it easy to ever catch up on that demand. Our supply is really, really falling behind. I think, to have a policy change for small local builders would be an amazing thing. But I think that there's other, things that contribute to our housing crisis, and where landlords do get, a bad name. And for me, one of them, and I see this day in, day out with other investor friends, they are turning, some of their properties and they're giving them over to social housing. So, when that happens, and that social housing could be anything, that could be, children coming out of the care system. It could be, domestic violence. It could be immigration, housing immigrants that have come over that are being processed. It could be offenders coming out and, having that fresh start. It could be homeless. It could be simply, families that need accommodation. There's a whole host of social housing that is out there. But more and more over the last probably 5 years, the private rental sector has been used to prop that up for the government, because they're not doing their job in social housing. I honestly, and I may, I'm going to annoy quite a few landlords who are getting a good return out of this. I honestly don't believe that social housing should be in the private landlord sector. I don't believe it. I think it should be a government funded and government managed thing, because we're here to give housing to people who want to rent for whatever reasons. And that could be that they are transient, that they just don't want to rent ever, they don't want to buy anything ever. That's been our market for a couple of decades ago, and now it's really changed. It's gone into social housing.
My concern is merry-go-round of taxation and government spending. Again, just taking a kind of step back from the whole specifics of social housing, which I too have big concerns about. When I first started investing in property, which was 1996, that was the first time I bought my first rental property. It was a student shared house. And I was very aware that those students at that time, they received grants. It was before the student loan system was introduced. So many of in fact, I'd say all the students who were living in this shared house were receiving government funding. I was then charging them rent, and they were then using their government funded grants to pay me rent. I would then receive that rent, and at the end of the year, I would do my tax return. I would send in the tax to the government that I owed on the income, the profit from that rental property. And it seems to me rather ironic that this was a real merry-go-round, that I was receiving rent that I was paying to the government in the form of tax. The government was then collecting up that tax, and then they were siphoning it through various different systems, ending up in the pockets of students who were then paying me as a landlord. Now, I've seen that time and time again, not just with students, but with adults. So I've got a property at the moment, and the lady who's living there, she's got 2 children. She's full-time on benefits. She gets universal credit, and she gets all the other benefits that go with it. So again, it's benefits that are paying her. She then pays me her rent. The rent comes into my account. At the end of the year, I do my tax return. I send off a certain proportion to the tax man, which goes into a big pot, which pays her benefit. And it seems to me a very, very sort of circular kind of market. Now, this is a very dangerous situation to get into, because what we do know is that whenever the government is a conduit for money, they use it extremely inefficiently, and there are huge amounts of cost. So the £10 that I give to the government in terms of my taxation, for example, will be returned probably as little as 50p to that claimant of housing benefit or universal credit, because of all the machinations it has to go through. Once it reaches the HMRC, it then has to be siphoned through government accounts. There are obviously many committees that will make a decision on how much the universal credit is going to be. If you think about all those layers and layers and layers of local and national government that my £10 of taxation has to be filtered through before it actually comes back into the system and goes into my tenant's pocket in terms of her universal credit. And you've got that happening every month, every year, every decade, every century. So for me, social housing is a very, very pernicious housing approach. I would far, far rather that we made it possible for people to buy their own home. I would far rather that we had much more supply in the private rental market so that rents were much cheaper, so that people did not have to rely on benefits to be able to make work pay. And again, we've heard this phrase from politicians for years and years and years, that we need to make work pay. Work still doesn't pay. For many people who are on minimum wage and they've got children and they're in, let's say, private rental accommodation, they would actually make more money if they went on to benefits and if they stopped working. And this is a real disincentive. And within our economy, we've got to think about what are the incentives that we are creating for people, whether they're tenants, whether they're landlords, whether they're investors, whether they are builders, because these incentives are what is fundamental to the effective working of an economy. And at the moment, we have an incentive that simply doesn't work for people. Again, let's go back to the incentives on landlords. When George Osborne brought in Section 24 in 2014, this had a chilling effect on the private rental sector. And over the last 10 years, we've steadily seen landlords selling up properties. And there has been a gradual drop over the years in the private rental sector. And as you point out, many landlords now are making the choice, rather than selling up, what I'll do is I'll rent my home to the local authority, or I'll rent it to a private company like Sears or Mears, I should say. It's Mears or Serco or Clear Springs. They're the main organisations that have these government contracts for asylum seekers, for other social and supported living projects. But the problem is that has removed a huge tranche of properties from the private rental sector. So while those landlords may well be feeling smug and sitting pretty because, they're getting their income now and, everybody's happy because they can keep their property. But the fact is, of course, that you and I are paying for those properties through our taxation system. And this, again, is a reason why many landlords are leaving the sector, because like you, they don't want to offer their properties into the social housing market because of all those other inherent ramifications, but also because they are feeling squeezed more and more and more and more through taxation, through regulation, through licensing, which is another form of taxation, of course, and looking at the risk that they're taking and the price that they're paying. And let's not forget that there are many small landlords who have. I believe that the average portfolio size of the average landlord in the UK is 2 properties. For most people who are landlords, they do it as a side income. They do it maybe as a way of building up something towards their pension or something for their children to inherit, or a way in which they can build something for the future. They may be on a capital repayment mortgage, or they might have paid it off altogether, and in which case Section 24 doesn't apply to them. Nevertheless, what we have done is for those small landlords who, again, make up the majority of the ownership or in the private rental sector and offer great value to their tenants. They are not rogue landlords. Again, this myth that we have rogue landlords actually is a proportion of the whole. It's a tiny proportion of the whole. But we have got this narrative that every landlord is a rogue, greedy landlord. And we've got a narrative that, all tenants are good and clean and polish their halo every morning. And you and I know, Sarah, that is absolutely so far from the truth as to be unbelievable. What we need is a marketplace for property. In my mind, there is no problem with having properties that are a little bit drafty, a little bit harder to heat, perhaps a little bit of damp. It's not going to kill you, but guess what? You get £150 cheaper rent every month because, frankly, unless that landlord charges £150 less rent per month, he's not going to be able to rent it out. But the problem is that we have central planners who have decided that rental should be low, which is why we've got the Renters' Rights Bill coming in, of course, but also that we want to try and reduce the supply. Well, of course, all that does is put up demand, particularly when we see the demographics that we have in the UK at the moment in terms of immigration, in terms of population growth. We've got more and more and more demand on the private rental sector. And the only result is going to be increased rents. So, in fact, the Renters' Rights Bill is going to do absolutely nothing to address the problem of rent levels. It's going to exacerbate it. And I predict that between now and May the 1st, when the commencement date is of the Renters' Rights Bill, we're going to see massive rent increases imposed on private rental tenants, because that is the only way that landlords are going to protect themselves.
With the Section 24, where there was, as you said, a chill-in of the market and landlords exited, we are seeing that again. So people are exiting and being a landlord. As we've said, they might go to social, but they might just sell up. It doesn't solve anything. When they've sold, they may sell to an owner-occupier because actually they bought a property back into trashed and needing refurb to a good rental. It's now something that an owner-occupier might want. It doesn't actually solve anything. One person gets a house, but we're still left with all the thousands that do need housing. So if every landlord sold up, it wouldn't solve anything. I think that's probably my point on that, that it wouldn't actually make a difference. So when people say, the landlord shouldn't have the property, I'd love to see, in this parallel universe, everyone sells up, what happens next?
I think because, of course, what we've got to appreciate is there's about 25% of people in the private rental sector who will never be able to get a mortgage and actually don't want to get a mortgage. They've chosen to live in rented accommodation for various different other reasons. And that's their choice. Again, we should not be denying them the choice as to how they want to live. What bothers me, though, is government interference is going to create it very hard for those people as they get older. Their salary might not necessarily be increasing by a huge amount every year, but due to the reduction in supply, they're going to find their rental costs are going up and up and up and up. It's going to require them to possibly move out, to downsize, to perhaps live somewhere that isn't quite as nice as they used to live in, because there isn't the choice available to them anymore. And I think that's really damaging to the private rental sector. And of course, it's those kind of issues that take a few years to actually have this domino effect, where people are beginning to see the domino effect. And then you get organisations like Shelter and Generation Rent who start to bleat about the fact that rents are very high and we need to have rent controls, which we know don't work. they've been tried and they simply don't work. They just make all housing much, much worse for everybody. And again, you have another exodus of landlords from the sector. What we need is more landlords in the sector, not fewer. We need to, again, incentivize landlords to invest. We need to make it possible for them to invest. And if we were to do that, then we would actually need less investment in social housing, because the price of renting privately would be such that people could afford it. They could afford it on a minimum wage. They could afford to get, to get into their own property, albeit it's a rented property, but nevertheless, it would be affordable. And this is what I just don't think this government or the previous government really understood. When you free up the market to let it do its job without government planning, it actually enables everybody to get better. It enables everybody to have more choice, to have more freedom, and it reduces costs.
I think it's ironic that we're doing this when on the day of the budget, because I fear that when we hear the news later on today, none of it's going to be about productivity. All of it's going to be about tax at this level, at that level, at, whatever it could be, tourist tax, VAT rates, the threshold coming down. It's going to be tax. None of it's going to be productivity. And that's pretty much what the problem is. If we look to, we discussed the housing supply and how the top 6 or 7 housing builders are controlling that market and have such higher costs. It's a replica of what is happening in the private rental market with, as we said, the majority of our landlords own 1 or 2. That is the sector. They're exiting. Who's buying them up? It is people like BlackRock, corporations, BlackRock and Lloyds, and even Waitrose. I think John Lewis are buying up rental stock. Is that what the general public really want? I wonder.
Oh, and I think that's a very good point. I mean, what we do know, of course, is a lot of those big builders, those national builders, are also in the pockets of national government. They contribute quite a lot in terms of funding. They donate to those policies or parties which they think are going to, support them. So there's a lot of, flow in terms of between a national builder and government. And this is, of course, where you have centralized power, which becomes very, very big and unwieldy. It's going to be influenced. I mean, that is actually the nature of fascism. Fascism is where governments prefer certain companies over others, where they prefer the big national home builders to build, and we'll give them incentives and support to be able to build big housing estates, rather than local builders, small builders who simply don't have the voice, they don't have the power, they don't have the influence to act at that national house building level. But actually, they're the ones that can make the biggest difference. And again, to me, this is a very, very big risk. I mean, did you know, for example, when we're looking, just going back to the social housing issue, I've just very quickly looked it up actually on the internet. In 2022-23, the government spent an estimated £11.4 billion on local authority housing. So this is a huge amount of money that's being spent on local authority housing. And you said something, Sarah, that's very interesting, which is productivity. When we have our GDP, or rather not our gross domestic product, but a GDP per capita, so this is per person, flatlining, we are not seeing growth in the economy. I mean, by some standards, you could say that we're probably in recession. I think the OBR seems to manage to massage the figures to the extent that we're not technically in recession, because we technically haven't had 2 quarters of negative growth. I think other economists would very much argue with those figures and would say, no, we are definitely in recession. We have been for quite a long time. Some economists would say, actually, since the global financial crash of 2008, we've really been in recession, because a lot of the growth has simply been fueled by government debt. It hasn't actually been, there has been no growth. We've just simply managed to maintain our living standards through, excessive government debt. But unless we can get growth happening, unless we can get productivity up, unless we can get people back to work, making stuff, building stuff, doing stuff, selling stuff, it's the basics of a trading economy. If we cannot get that, this cost is going to balloon yet further. More and more people are going to be eligible for social housing. More and more people are going to want and need social housing. And more of the private rental sector is going to be dragged into providing social housing because there's going to be fewer private rental tenants to rent. And I think, again, we're seeing a real shift. And because these are shifting sands that take time to move, because the housing market is massive. I mean, the construction industry is the biggest industry in the UK, I think, apart from banking and banking services, but in terms of SME output, it takes the biggest share of SME output. And because construction, of course, has other wings to it. So, if you have a construction company, then you're also going to have somebody who's providing furniture. You're going to have somebody who's supplying you with paint. You're going to have somebody who's going to be supplying you with carpets. It's all those other services and goods that are relative to building a house, for example, that make money when a house is built or when a house is bought. It doesn't have to be a new build. Anybody who buys a house is very likely to, want to do some decoration or buy some new furniture or, spend money on their new property. And this, of course, goes into the economy. And the problem we've got at the moment is we have an economy that's flatlining. So our productivity is stagnant. We can see, jobs market figures every quarter are getting worse and worse and worse. We're seeing the impact of the national insurance changes, of course, as well, in terms of employers not wishing to employ people. So while that is ticking over in the background on the one hand, you've equally got the problem of housing on the other. We have not got a glut of housing, a glut of cheap housing that people can live in. And I can only see things in the short term getting much, much worse.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I usually like to end on a bit of a positive on these podcasts, but not feeling it, to be honest, about this.
Well, I would like to end on a positive as well, because I think that's really important. I think if you can ride the storm, if you can set your mind to providing a good service for tenants and providing good quality homes, whether it's rooms in an HMO or single buy-to-let properties or apartments or flats or whatever, I think there's always going to be a market for them. Now, you're going to have to be clever. You have to be wise. You have to be wily as a property investor. You have to get your breaks where you can. That means working with a good accountant to lower your tax bill as far as you possibly can. It means being savvy about knowing when to refinance your properties. It means able to spot a market deal, to understand what the market is doing in your area, to know when there's a deal and when you're going to be making money and when you're going to be losing money. We're still investing in property. We're looking at a block of flats at the moment, evaluating that. Interestingly, it's a landlord who's moved to Spain. He's gone lock, stock and barrel, taken his family to Spain, emigrated out of there, doesn't want to be in the UK anymore, partly because of the weather. And he now has this block of flats that he wants to, offload. That's an opportunity. And I think there are some great opportunities out there. So I don't think it is all doom and gloom. I've been in property long enough to have seen many, many cycles and to understand there's always tough time and there's always a springtime. And right now, I kind of feel like we're in winter. We're also in winter in terms of investing. The ground is hard and frozen. There's frost everywhere you look. You go outside and your fingers get cold because the air is freezing cold and it's not very warm and friendly. But I think that will change. I think it's inevitable. It's going to have to change because otherwise we're going to have a huge crisis in the UK, bigger than the housing crisis we've currently got. So it will change. And I think people who maintain the fundamentals and stick to those fundamentals will continue to be successful investors. But you've got to be assiduous, you've got to be focused, you've got to know what you're doing. But I think if you do, you can make a great living out of investing in property.
I think it's lovely to finish on that and, have that hope of, we all manage our own productivity. If we all decide, right, we're going to be productive just in our management of time, but equally a contribution to the economy, then, if enough of us do it, then hopefully we can get to that springtime a little bit quicker. Thank you so much today, Wendy. It's been a fascinating chat with you. I've really enjoyed it. How can listeners and viewers get in touch with you?
So I've got a website, www.wendywl.uk. Lots of W's in that one. You can email me at wendywl.uk. Actually, if you search for me on Google, there are not very many Whittaker-Larges out there. I think I'm the only one. So if you search for me on Google, you'll probably find me one way or t'other.
Fantastic. Thank you again. And we shall both be now watching the news as to what we've been ahead of us on the budget.
Thank you, Sarah.